Have you ever noticed how easily you can talk around some people, yet the moment a certain person enters the room, something inside you becomes quieter, not completely silent, just smaller. Your words become shorter. Your thoughts stay inside your head. The version of you that usually laughs, shares stories, and speaks freely seems to step backward and disappear behind a curtain you never consciously pulled closed. And what makes this confusing is that it does not happen with everyone. You can spend hours talking with one person and feel completely yourself, then sit across from someone else and suddenly struggle to find even simple words. For a long time, you may have wondered why. You may have assumed you were shy, or awkward, or socially anxious, but often what is happening runs much deeper than that, because the silence is usually selective, not random. It is not that you have forgotten how to speak. It is that something about a specific person changes how safe speak up. NG feels. Many people who experience this do not realize it is happening in real time. They simply notice the outcome, the shortened conversations, the hesitation, the feeling of leaving an interaction thinking, why wasn't I myself? Yet the answer often begins long before the conversation ever starts. Human beings are constantly reading emotional environments, not consciously, but quietly, almost automatically, like an internal radar operating beneath awareness. When you enter a room, your mind is not only observing what people say, it is also observing how they react, how they look at you, how they respond to your emotions, whether they seem interested or dismissive, warm or critical, accepting or evaluating. And those observations happen incredibly fast, sometimes within seconds. When someone makes you feel accepted, your nervous system relaxes. Thoughts flow naturally. Words arrive without effort. You become more spontaneous, more authentic, more alive. But when someone makes you feel observed rather than accepted, something different happens. Your attention shifts away from expressing yourself and toward monitoring yourself. Instead of participating in the conversation, you begin watching yourself inside the conversation. You start checking every sentence before it leaves your mouth. You analyze your tone, you question your reactions, you wonder how you appear, and suddenly speaking feels less natural, because now your mind is trying to perform and participate at the same time. This creates a subtle split inside you. One part of you wants to connect. The other part is busy evaluating whether connection is safe. The result often looks like silence, but underneath that silence is usually intense activity. Thoughts are still there. Feelings are still there. Words are still there. They simply become trapped behind caution, like cars waiting at a traffic signal that never turns green. What makes this especially difficult? Is that the person causing this reaction may not even realize they are doing it. Sometimes they are openly critical. Sometimes they are emotionally unpredictable. Sometimes they simply carry an energy that feels difficult to relax around. And sometimes they remind you of someone from your past. This is where psychology becomes particularly interesting. Because the nervous system does not only respond to what is happening now, it also responds to what feels familiar. A person can unknowingly resemble an old authority figure, an emotionally distant parent, a judgmental teacher, a sibling whose approval felt impossible to earn, someone whose presence once taught you that being fully yourself carried emotional risks. The mind remembers patterns, even when the conscious memory has faded. So when a similar emotional atmosphere appears, old protective responses quietly return, not because you are weak, not because you are broken, but because your nervous system learned something long ago and is trying to keep you safe. The strange thing about protection is that it often disguises itself as personality. You may tell yourself, I'm just quiet around certain people, but what appears to be personality is sometimes adaptation, a survival strategy that became automatic, like an old route your mind continues driving long after the original destination disappeared. This often begins in childhood. A child enters the world naturally expressive, curious, spontaneous, emotionally honest. Children do not spend much time wondering whether they are saying the right thing. They simply exist. But gradually, every child learns which parts of themselves are welcomed and which parts create tension. Some learn that excitement is welcomed. Others learn it is too much. Some learn that sadness receives comfort. Others learn it receives impatience. Some learn that mistakes are treated gently. Others learn that mistakes invite criticism, and without realizing. Children begin adjusting, not because they want to become different, but because belonging matters, acceptance matters, connection matters. A child would rather shrink than risk losing emotional closeness. So little by little, certain parts of the self become quieter, not gone, just hidden. like furniture covered by sheets in a familiar room that nobody enters anymore. As adolescence arrives, these patterns often become stronger. Teenagers are especially sensitive to social evaluation. The brain becomes highly attuned to belonging, status, and acceptance. A single glance can feel significant. A single criticism can echo for weeks. And during these years, many people become experts at reading emotional signals. They learn how to adapt to different personalities, how to avoid rejection, how to stay emotionally safe. The skill becomes so refined that eventually it happens on autopilot. By adulthood, the pattern may feel completely normal. You enter different environments and become different versions of yourself, not intentionally, automatically. Around some people you feel expansive, around others restricted. Around some people you feel like home, around others you feel like a guest constantly worried about breaking something. And because the adjustment happens so quickly, you rarely notice the moment it begins. You only notice the exhaustion afterward, the feeling that you disappeared somewhere during the interaction, the feeling that you left pieces of yourself behind. What many people misunderstand is that silence is not always the absence of confidence. Sometimes silence is the presence of vigilance. A vigilant mind is busy predicting, busy monitoring, busy calculating, busy trying to avoid emotional danger, even when no actual danger exists. And this is why selective silence can feel so confusing, because it creates two very different realities. One version of you feels expressive, the other feels constrained. One feels natural, the other feels edited, and both feel real. Yet there is a deeper truth hidden beneath this experience. The quiet version of you is not your truest self, but neither is it your enemy. In fact, that quietness often began as an act of protection. A younger part of you learned that becoming smaller reduced emotional risk, so it built a blanket around vulnerability, a shield around authenticity, an anchor designed to keep you steady during uncertain emotional waters. The problem is not that the strategy exists. The problem is that it sometimes remains active long after the original threat has passed. And this brings us to an important reframing. Your silence is often not evidence that you have nothing to say. It is evidence that some part of you is still checking whether it is safe to be heard. That changes everything, because suddenly the silence becomes understandable, compassionate, human. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" a differ and question emerges. What is this silence trying to protect? For many people, the answer is surprisingly emotional. It may be protecting them from embarrassment, from rejection, from criticism, from feeling misunderstood, from experiencing the same emotional pain they once felt years ago. And when you see the silence through that lens, it stops looking like weakness. It starts looking like history, a history carried quietly into present moments. As life continues, people often notice something unexpected. The individuals who make them feel accepted require almost no effort to talk to. Conversations feel easy, not because these people are perfect, but because they create emotional space, a space where mistakes are allowed, where authenticity feels welcome, where expression does not feel like a performance. These relationships often feel like returning home after a long journey, like entering a familiar room where nothing needs to be explained, where you can sit down, own, exhale, and simply be. And perhaps that is why selective silence reveals something important about human psychology. We do not become ourselves in isolation. We become ourselves in relationships. Certain people expand us. Certain people contract us. Certain people invite expression. Certain people invite self-monitoring. And the nervous system notices every difference, quietly, constantly, without asking permission. Over time, many people begin recognizing these shifts more clearly. They start noticing when they feel observed instead of accepted, when they become performers instead of participants, when they shrink instead of expand, not because they are trying to judge themselves, but because awareness naturally grows. The pattern becomes visible, and once visible, it no longer feels mysterious. It becomes part of a larger story. A story about belonging, about emotional safety, about the invisible ways human beings adapt to their environments. And perhaps the most beautiful realization arrives when you stop treating every version of yourself as a problem to solve, because the quiet version of you emerged for a reason. It was trying to help, trying to protect, trying to navigate a world that once felt uncertain. That version deserves understanding too. The goal is not to criticize the silence, nor to force yourself into constant confidence. The goal is simply to recognize what the silence has been carrying all along, because beneath the quietness is often a person who never lacked depth, never lacked thoughts, never lacked personality. Only a person who learned to measure safety before revealing themselves. And if you have ever become smaller around certain people, it does not mean that the smaller version is who you truly are. It simply means your mind learned to adapt, like a traveler carrying an old map long after the landscape changed. The silence was never random. It was meaningful. It was protective. It was human. And perhaps there is something comforting in knowing that the parts of yourself that go quiet are not disappearing at all. They are simply waiting for the feeling of acceptance, waiting for the warmth of emotional safety, waiting for the moment when the room feels less like a stage and more like home. And when you understand that, the silence no longer feels like a flaw. It feels like a story of adaptation, a story of belonging, a story of a mind that did its best to protect the person carrying it. And that person has been you all along.